Right, so welcome to the passive and active voice workshop. This is a workshop that's designed to give you enough tools so that you can identify active voice and passive voice, and then to be able to make some determinations on what you want to use when, so that you can be strategic in those choices. So our time together, this is what I'm going to talk about, a little bit about CSU Rate's program and style and our style considerations, because right now when we're talking about active and passive voice, we're talking about something that is maybe a style consideration for you in your field. I'll talk a little bit about that, but because we're talking about things really, really broadly, we'll talk about them in just kind of general terms that should apply to all fields so that you can kind of figure out where it is that yours is. I'll talk about the writing community guide that we have, talk about subjects, verbs, and voice, and we'll again make parts of sentences and parts of speech more enjoyable, hopefully, than they have been in the past, maybe in your experiences. There are some exercises. I didn't actually pop them into the chat, so if you need them, please let me know, and I will try to maneuver that and get those in there for those who are here live and in real time. And then but they're also attached to that Outlook invite, by the way. And we'll talk about reasons why you might use or elect not to use active voice, which means then you would be turning to passive voice. And I've got some resources for you as well. And just a reminder that CSU Writes, we're a professional support writing program. We just help you write more frequently and with greater ease. And we have faculty streams, grad streams, doc streams for postdocs and team streams. But again, if you're a postdoc and you're here, it's because you can attend whatever you want. Just know that. And we're funded by the graduate school and the VPR's office. And we address those kind of 5 areas there where research and scholarly writers tend to get bunged up or struggle the most. And those are with where do you write, your space, when do you write, your time, how do you keep things moving forward? That's your energy and momentum, whether that be individual to you or to your project. We talk about style, and that's what we're here for today, and then collaboration. And we don't cover everything all the time, but you can kind of pop into what it is that's working for you and helping you out, and where it is that you can use some targeted support. And just a reminder, we have a community guide, which just reminds us to come together and be present, honest, and authentic when we come together. And that after our time together, we share only what is ours to share, meaning all of the ideas, all of the advice, the strategies, please share that out. But if anybody shares anything or questions that have pertain to their own writing or their own projects, we just don't share about other people's work. So I'm going to have you watch for some takeaways on this one. Always kind of, you may know a fair amount. In fact, I asked those who were here a little bit earlier, like how many, know the difference between passive and active voice or can identify that. And most people, yes, that you're pretty good on that already. So just watch for some of the things that are landing with you that will support you in your own crafting of your writing when you choose to use active voice or select to use passive voice. And I have a caveat for all of us here, that just a reminder that passive voice sentences are not really bad guys, they're not villains. So what happens sometimes is we have these dictates that come down to us through advisors or PIs or well-meaning instructors or writing teachers who have said, never use passive voice, or, stop using it. And so they can come across as being bad. We often will ask for revisions of passive voice, right? So, or trying to work on that. And if you have, like I did, I shared earlier that I had a propensity to write every sentence in passive voice, which makes it really hard for your readers to kind of follow what you're writing about. That you might want to practice at writing only in active voice for a while until you get that practice, until you understand kind of how to do that. But we will be discussing the debate, that value between passive voice and academic writing and scientific writing, and how to identify them. Yeah. Yeah. Writing it consistently in the passive voice. And it can also be for those of you who are non-native English writers, depending on where it is that you're coming from. So I had neighbors for a number of years at Michigan State University who were from Nepal and in forestry, I think. And so I was consistently working with one of my paying it forward to the community was to do writing support. And so the use of passive voice was pretty common. And so we had to work a lot on active and passive voice, in part because they were like, well, this sounds better in English, right? So we'll talk about that. So just a reminder that a sentence is simply a complete thought. You can have really short sentences. You can actually have one-word sentences, or you can have, I don't know, dozens of word sentences. The longer the sentence gets, the harder it is for your readers to hold all of that in their head, though, as a reminder. But in order for it to be a complete thought, it has to have a subject, who or what that sentence is about, and then a verb, which is the state of being of that subject, or it is the action, the activity of that subject. So, and a verb, we can also talk about it as a predicate. So it includes the verb plus objects or other things. So I'm going to give you some examples, and everything that we do in this webinar, I'm going to take you through and just give you some examples so that you can see it in the sentence at the sentence level. So that subject, who or what it is about, the verb, that's the action or the condition of the subject, right? And then if you have an object or something else after that, it's usually who or what is affected by the verb in the simplest breakdown of a sentence. So we're going to use superheroes for this. My hope is that it works for you and that it's not too, simplistic, but I think that it works for me to be able to hear and identify what's active, what's moving. So if we have a sentence like superheroes fight battles valiantly, we have superheroes as the subject, fight is the verb, it's who or what those superheroes do. And then here, what's the action or of this kind of the fighting? It's the battles, right? And valiantly is describing the type of battles. So that's an adverb. All right. So you can add in a whole bunch of other descriptors or language. And when you do that, and it's really, really common in academic writing, right? We want our work to be detailed, precise, accurate. It's highly specialized, what we're talking about. This is not highly specialized, but it does give you a sense of, you can just start adding in additional descriptors and different words and different parts of speech that will add more meaning, perhaps, to your sentence, but it won't change the central idea. So your central idea is always carried by that subject and that verb combo. So the subject remains superheroes and the verb remains fight. And you can talk about them as comic book superheroes or other types of superheroes. You can talk about how they fight, which is always perhaps, and you can add things like how those battles are, how they're fighting valiantly and intelligently, right? But it still winds up being the same kind of core sentence, right? What's your simple subject? What's your simple verb? So we get to active and passive voice. That's really how it is that we're shaping the relationship between the agent of the sentence and the subject. Okay, so let's take a look at, in active sentences, the subject does the action. So we heard that superheroes fight. So the subject is clearly doing that action. But in passive sentences, the subject receives the action. So they're still sentences, they still have subjects and they still have verbs, but in the passive construction, that subject is receiving the action. And so that's why it becomes passive, right? So active, the subject does the action. Passive, the subject is receiving the action. And so let's take a look at some of these sentences, like superheroes fight battles, right? That's active. But if we flip it and we take what is in the object position of battles in the prior sentence, and we make battles the subject of the sentence, now we have battles are fought valiantly by superheroes. The superheroes who are the agents, they're still the agents of action, but they're no longer in the subject position structurally in that sentence. That structural move makes it so that passive, we talk it as passive, so that the superheroes, the subject, now those are further back, and we prioritize as the subject of the sentence the main idea, now that battles are fought. And this is important. It'll make a difference for when we talk about your research and how you're describing ideas, concepts, methods, right? That the way that you're putting together an active versus passive sentence will determine how you highlight and what you highlight as the main kind of subject of your sentence. So in this one, the top one and the active one, we're highlighting and focusing on superheroes. But notice that in the passive construction, we're focusing on battles. And if you're ever kind of going sideways in your writing, you're trying to figure out like, I'm trying to say something, but it doesn't seem to be coming out right. It may be just that you need to flip around some of what it is that your sentences are focusing on, so that you really, in the subject position, are talking about what the content, the thing that you want to speak on. So I do it all the time too. I'll be like, this sentence just isn't working for me. Oh, I should probably just rearrange it. So again, active sentence, Superman hurled the car into the building, versus in the passive construction, the agent of that action, right, is elsewhere. And so the car was hurled into the building by Superman. Notice that oftentimes the word by will signal something that's passive voice, not always. We can have other ones, and we'll look at that in a moment. And there's some on the worksheet that's attached to the Outlook invite. The information from the Thompson Writing Program at Duke, they just have some fabulous resources. So I highly recommend them as just in general a resource. But they have a couple different pamphlets on passive and active voice, one specific to scientific writing. So it's also attached to your email, but they're super useful. And say that passive voice, if you're using it in the sentence, the subject of the sentence is being acted upon, right? Then rather than acting itself. So passive voice is an anvil was dropped on the coyote by the roadrunner, versus active voice, which is the roadrunner dropped an anvil on the coyote. So one is much more direct with the action, the other one less direct, right? We're focusing on the anvil in the passive voice. We're focusing on the roadrunner dropping the anvil in the second one. So this is the practice worksheet. And we used to do this, of course, in person when we do these in person, and sometimes we still do, but this one is a webinar, so we can have folks, and so many of you are from other places in the state or in the nation, or even out of the country, that it's nice to have you here and be able to practice with us virtually. So just know that you have this as attachment. It's not fillable. It's not a fillable PDF, but you should be able to access it beyond our session. And we'll talk about each one of these, and I'll just take you through the exercises in this practice. So again, if we think about it, you can change the subject and the topics of the sentences, right? That subject does the action, but so it's the biologist bisected the specimen. This is our example of the subject clearly being the agent. The biologist is bisecting. But in passive sentences, that subject receives the action. So the specimen was bisected by the biologist. And then again, in passive voice sentences, sometimes they're not indicated just by. You can have an agent that's just absent. And so when we say the specimen was bisected, that's still a sentence, we still know that the specimen was cut right in two, but notice that who's doing the cutting, that agent of the cutting is not there in that sentence. And so that's when we start to get a little sideways with sentences sometimes, if we want them to be clear and direct, and maybe they're vague and they're like, well, I'm not sure who's doing what here. That can happen pretty easily if we're writing in passive voice. So let's take a look at some of these sentences, and you can just think, or you can pop in the chat for each one that I read through. So for number one, the table shows the analysis for the intensive program, specifically focusing on the teacher subgroup. So table 3 shows the analysis for the intensive program. Is this active or is this passive? So people are saying active. Yes, good. It's active. Yes, because we have the table and it shows. Sometimes your advisors will tell you graphs don't show anything, or tables don't show anything. They don't have agency. So, right, or table describes, or, because table's not describing anything, right? So good, awesome. What about number 2? From table 3, we see that students who self-identified as Chinese on average gave higher ratings than Japanese students. So from table 3, we see That's students who identified. Yeah. So this one's active as well. We see is the subject. So from table 3, now table 3 is not doing anything. It's just kind of set off with a comma. And the subject of that sentence is actually we. And what do? We see. So that one's active. All right, so number 3, let's go through that one. Each member of the study is considered to have different life experiences. Each member of the study is considered to have different life experiences. Yep. So let's go with passive on that one. And the reason for that is who's doing the considering, right? It's member is the subject, but considering who's doing that is considered. We don't know who that person is doing the considering. All right. Number 4, the BDV was defined as the rapid increase of the current at voltage threshold followed by zero current. BVD or BDV was defined. Yep, passive. 5, recent concerns about the expenditure of energy for human transportation highlight the need for more efficient passenger vehicles. So what about recent concerns about the expenditure of energy for human transportation highlight the need for? Yeah, this one's active, but it's tricky, right? Because we have, interestingly enough, we have these concerns as a subject. The verb, however, is all the way over here as highlight. So the concerns highlight, and then we have all of these prepositional phrases and information in between that keeps the subject from the verb. We'll talk about that. So sometimes you can get lost in sentences like that, but concerns highlight, so that one's active. And then we propose several solutions. Yep. We, subject, propose. Yep, that's active. Good. All right, and you can think about whether you would use another structure. And please go through, and if you want to revise and play with these, feel free. This one is a passive sentence, and you can make it active. So the measurements were made by the technician concerning the speed of cell division. And notice it's by the technician, so it's pretty easy to flip this and make it so that the technician measured, right, the speed of cell division. That makes it much tidier, actually, as a sentence. Or you can take an active sentence and you can make it passive. So technology often drives science. Someone in the chat, how would you make that passive? Yep. So it's technology is driven by science. You could do that. Is that correct, though? Yep, there we go. Science is often driven by technology. Science is driven by technology. Yep, there we go. So then it takes the subject by. Yep. So you want to make sure that when you're making it passive, that you know kind of who still is that agent. And in this sense, it's that technology, right, is the agent, but you want to make it so that it's then passive. That's where. All right. And so if you were to do this as a worksheet, it might look something like that. If you ever get stuck and if you want a kind of a quick way to identify subjects and verbs, you could just go through and you can underline a single underline and then double underline for verbs. That's an old school way of doing it, but it's nice to be able to see kind of how those sentences break down. All right, so let's talk about some debates over passive versus active voice sentences. So I love this from American biology teacher, and I pulled this from Duke as well. But according to Randy Moore, most scientists use passive voice, either out of habit or to make themselves seem scholarly, objective, or sophisticated. Right? Scientists have not always written in passive voice, and so this is important for us to know that fields change, how we write in fields changes, so that it's not always, one conventional way. So first person pronouns such as I and we began to disappear from scientific writing in the United States in the 1920s when active voice was replaced by today's inflections, or inflexible, impersonal, and often boring style of scientific writing, making it so that passive voice became much more popular. That's in part to highlight at the sentence structure, either methods or processes or other things, and we'll talk about ways and reasons for that. But just note that if you're highlighting who does what or giving credit, you're highlighting the actor or the agent. And oftentimes what scientific writing has increasingly done is highlight that, or obscure sometimes the agent. All right.
Christina?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so is there a I mean, it seems like now we're talking about first person versus what would you call the opposite? Third person?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So third
So
person. Yep.
so is he saying that scientific writing today is more passive versus active, or more third person versus first person, or both?
He's saying that it's more passive than it is active, and that sometimes in third person it would be more like omniscient. So like somehow you are the engineer who's overseeing all of this, but kind of with that godlike view, and that you're not necessarily you're talking about the processes, but so that something was done, something did happen. And when you describe things in that way, as if somehow individuals aren't part of it, or who's doing the action is not really part of that sentence, it can make it seem like there's a more distanced view or a more objective view at the sentence level, but it can also make it harder to understand who's doing what at the sentence level. I don't know if that
But we're
helps.
correct me if I'm wrong. We're not supposed to write in first person.
Right. It depends on your field. So I think there are some fields, scholarly fields in particular, where first person is necessary. Like positionality would be something where you want to say who you are as a researcher or as a scholar coming to a certain topic. If you are writing about processes or something that's external to you, you are likely to not want to have any first person pronouns in there, because you really want the focus to be on what you're talking about that's observed or external to who you are. So I think,
So instead of saying like I discovered X as a result of my survey, you would say the survey results reflected X or something.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. That's perfect. That's exactly what you want to do. And so that focuses on something that's external, on the survey results, right?
And
Rather
that's
than
considered inflexible, impersonal, and boring, huh?
it can be. Well, according to Randy Moore,
Oh my
yeah,
goodness.
yeah, I know. I think there was a lot more play, and sometimes what happens with play in language and can be that things might also, because language is also flexible and words can have multiple meanings, that as soon as you become too um, playful with your language, the accuracy or the precision rate might go down, I think, with what you're representing. So I think that there was some increased concern in the 20th century in particular to make sure that more precise, more accurate, clear, reproducible, right? You want to have, particularly if you're doing bench experiments, you want to make sure that what you're putting out there is reproducible. So yeah, good question. Thanks. But Jay Kirkman says something that, slightly, nuanced and different, but I think this gets to your point too, Dean, and how is it you phrase things, like expressions such as was performed, or the results or the survey revealed, or I guess did reveal, or something, were conducted, were experienced, were carried out, was achieved, was shown, were affected, were observed, resulted, occurred, are desperately overworked in scientific writing because scientists are reluctant to write directly and personally. So that's the fallback of not having first person, right? So the writer who wants to say, we calculated the yield and found that, blah, 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 pauses, and he says that contorts his thought into the clumsier expression of calculations of the yield were performed, which revealed that, right? So I think the point is that you can streamline some of this at the sentence level using active voice, but it requires that you have to write directly and personally. And it may be, as Dean points out, that in your field just doesn't do that. And so then you do kind of have to go for the more passive or the clumsier, in this case, is what Kirkman's saying, expression.
Would it be better to say at the end there, calculations of the yield revealed, and skip that were performed which?
Yep, you could, unless unless somehow that performing is important. Yeah.
I mean, to me, it's implied calculations. You
Yep.
had to perform.
You had to perform it. Yes, I agree.
Uh,
I agree. Yeah. So, and this may be something that as you're editing, you'd be like, oh, I don't need that extra words of editing for wordiness, taking that out. Yeah, for sure. See, there's it in the chat. Calculations yielded. Yep. But when you're getting anthropomorphic, yep. APA doesn't like that either. Yeah. And so when it is that calculations do things or take actions that seem to be the actions that would be what people do, then it becomes a little, yeah, trickier. Sure. All right, so let's talk about some of the reasons to use active or passive. And we've already been talking about some of those, right? So active voice, he did it, as a reminder. This is preferred by academic institutions. It's considered easier to read. Passive voice, it was done by him, right? That it avoids that personal reference and it gives agency to a process or method. And so particularly for those of you who are in your methods section, you may want to be relying on passive voice, quite honestly, just to get it so that you're not always, and we'll take a look at an example of a process being described in active voice and then in passive voice. And you can kind of hear and see what it is that sounds better in those sections. But you also want to be able to select carefully, right, on why it is that you're using active voice versus passive voice. And so I think you can hear it here. Again, this is like if you're a method, thinking about methods, right? So first, the virus strains most likely to cause disease are identified and 3 are selected for vaccine development. The virus samples of each selected strain are injected into separate batches of fertilized eggs to amplify the amount of virus. Each virus strain is grown separately inside the eggs over the course of several days, after which it's harvested, inactivated, and purified. And the purified virus strains are then combined to create the vaccine, blended with a carrier fluid, and dispensed into a vial. So is this active or passive? Yep. Yep. So we're looking at something here that's passive. You can tell it's like you've got the helping verbs, are identified, is grown, right? Is harvested. So who's doing the harvesting? Who's doing, right? The identifying, who's doing that? Who's doing are selected, right? Who's doing those selecting? That's those agents are elsewhere. They're not in those sentences. When you bring those agents in active voice into the sentences, this is what it reads like. So you have first, researchers identify the virus strains most likely to cause disease and select 3 for vaccine development. Technicians inject virus samples of each selected strain into separate batches of fertilized eggs to amplify the amount of virus. Technicians grow each virus strain separately inside the eggs over the course of several days, after which they harvest, inactivate, and purify it. The technicians then combine the purified virus strains to create the vaccine, blend it with the carrier fluid, and dispense it into vials. All right, so let's just consider which do you think reads more smoothly or easily? Which do you prefer? He says it feels like the agents add to the wordiness. Yeah, I don't know that they actually add more words, but it could see that there's also something, I think it's just something that's choppier, right? That's something the sentences don't build as smoothly from what was the last idea or last part mentioned into the new part. So it's kind of a repetition of the technicians. Yep, the technicians over and over again makes it feel that way. Do you have a preference? Anybody willing to share what their preference is and why?
I like the first one.
The first one, Dean? Why do you
Yeah,
like the first
yeah.
one?
I think that the second one, you added a bunch of words that weren't necessary. And you're sort of highlighting the who as opposed to the what.
There you go. Yes. Yep. So, and it's interesting. You've got some competition because yeah, there are others who appreciate the second one, and some people like the first one. Okay, so just pay attention to that. Those are differences in how it is that you're probably going as you're writing things up that you're going to prefer. That's part of your style if we think about it. The first one, what it does, as Jean points out, is it really focuses on virus strains, right? And then how it is that the vaccines are developed. So it's focusing on that developmental process. The other one, however, is focusing on who's doing what in the process. And so and I think that there's a point in the chat, right? That if who is necessary for maintaining some sense of reproducibility or making sure that that each step is clear or clarified. It may be that you want to use active in that. It could also be, and there's a third way to think about these. You could take sentences passive and active, and they don't exactly have to, go one right after the other, but you could alternate. And so you could clarify who the agents are at the very beginning of the paragraph, and then move into passive voice, and then end or wrap with active voice, or just kind of alternate and just kind of pick sentences that need to be active. Yeah. If there are different people taking actions, you might want to clarify, yes, that alternating, right? Who's doing what? If it's not always the same person, yep, that's a great idea. So, and this is it'll be on the recording, right? So if you want to, you can go back and you can look and see what are the subjects of those sentences, what are the verbs, so that you can identify and see how those are operating. But that's only if you're kind of geeky in language and want to do that. All right, so let's talk about whether on passive voice, we're talking about something that is like villain or hero in scientific writing. Passive voice particularly gets a bad rap. So let's talk about some of the arguments for active voice and arguments for passive voice. So in active voice, active sentences are generally shorter and clearer. So for those of you who heard in those two, like something a little bit more clearer, cleaner on the active voice, good. Active voice is more direct, engaged, or personal. Active voice is something that generally appropriately describes science, meaning that it describes clearly who is doing what. Many journals prefer active voice, and passive voice can sound pompous and impersonal. So passive voice can be a way that we kind of cover over things, because it hides who's doing what just a little bit. And passive voice can construct ambiguous agents. So going back to the point in the chat about if they have multiple people working on a project and you want to be able to identify who is doing what at different stages, it might be important for you not to have ambiguous agents. Right? Passive voice, however, it stresses what was done, which is just what we were talking about, right? It's great for doing writing methods. Active voice requires personal pronouns, and it may be that you want to have the focus on externals, as we have been talking about, rather than on subjects or who is doing what. Ultimately, passive voice sounds a little bit more scientific, right? It crafts that sense of objectivity, that you've got this kind of purview and vision of what has happened, who did what. And passive voice offers kind of syntax or structural sentence control. So for those when we were talking about, like, you could blend and blur some of those sentences, you could use an active sentence and alternate with passive, active, and passive voice. You can vary your sentence structures on whether they're active or passive for flow, connection, to create interest. So it's a great tool to be able to, if you can use it well, right? So some general guidelines for doing that. If you're talking about something that is done by a human, it's best probably when it's active, if you can see who it's there. So the theory of relativity was proposed by Einstein. Well, here we're talking about the main idea is theory, and it was proposed. It's harder to understand, though, what's being talked about in that sentence without Einstein being up front. So it's Einstein proposed the theory of relativity, and here that kind of active voice is a little bit better. If you have a process and something that's done, or something that's by a non-human agent, it might be best to have it in passive voice. So thinking about the enzyme is used by the cancer cells to replicate, maybe you want to have some passive voice there to be able to have a non-human agent being describing, kind of that process. The velocity is obtained by calculating the difference. This is passive, but it's not also becomes not clear. So who's obtaining velocity? It becomes awkward. So the difference in arrival time between two waves, you just want to look through and see, is that passive construction serving your purposes for clarity and concision, or is it kind of muddling things? And then you can make some of those decisions. There was a question in the chat. Yeah, so does qualitative or quantitative approach play a role in the voice choice? I don't know so much about the difference in methodology. However, I would think that with qualitative measures, there would be tendency to include more positionality. But so Marina, that's a great question. I like that. I don't know for sure though, but my instinct tells me qualitative would gear more towards positionality. All right, some advice. Reduce the distance between your subject and your verb because it makes it less wordy. So active voice often places the subjects and verbs closer together. Just as an FYI, if you're using passive voice, it may be that you're creating these gaps. Not always. We had an example sentence that was an active sentence that still had a lot of words between its subject and its verb. And what happens when you do that is that you have the reader hangs on to this is what the idea of the sentence is, and then they read through all of these personal health hazards, associated airborne disease, chlorine, and other gases. Oh my goodness. And now they get to the verb, has not been considered. And they're like, wait, matter has not been considered. But by the time they get through all of this, hazards, disease, gases, right? These are all things that are much bigger than matter. So it's really easy for folks to lose their way in those kinds of sentences or misunderstand what the point or the purpose of that sentence is. So you can just revise it. I would say our evacuation plan does not address the matter of personal health hazards associated with airborne free chlorine and other gases. So much clearer in this one. It's active voice, but it also puts the subject and the verb a little bit closer. Here we've changed it from being a matter of personal right to this in this plan. We just make it the plan is active and it does not address that matter. You can also see that when you're using equipment or talking about equipment that performs an action, that's often best done in active as well. Voice, it may not be a sentient thinking subject or agent, but it's still going to be the agent of the action. So a person doesn't have to be directly involved in the functioning of that equipment to have it be an active voice sentence. So the generator provided power to the motors. So generator provided, that's active. All right, I'm going to move quickly through just a couple other bits of advice and information from Duke Writing Studio before we open it up. Just a couple of reminders that passive voice involves the combination sometimes of the verb to be, when it, so it would be is, was, were, be, being, been, kind of those to be forms, and what is that called a past participial. So those are the verbs that have like an ed or other kind of endings. So you can look for if you see is, are, was, were, be, being, been, am, right? And then something connected to it with a verb form, right? So is written, was discovered, are being presented. You can kind of get a sense that those are passive constructions. Notice also that sentences that begin with it is, there is, this is, what is, I discovered, it was discovered that, excuse me. Those are going to create passive constructions. It may be that you are writing a fair number of passively constructed sentences that have it, there, or this at the beginning of them. I would just watch out for that. If you're looking for passive voice and how you can easily improve the quality of your writing by moving out or eliminating some passive voice, I would take out, or I would just do a search for how many of your sentences start with is, this, or it, or there. Try switching your sentence into active voice on a separate piece of paper. That will help you see it, right? So if you say Moby Dick was written by Herman Melville, you can just see it and lay it out and say Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick. And I would say shorten and get your sentences to the simple subject and verb-ish area like we've been working with here. If you've got 3 or 4 line sentences that are just bloated, it can be harder to do that kind of work. If your passive sentence doesn't have a subject, then you'll need to add one in order to be able to make it active. So the battle was lost, and here we have the Spanish lost the battle. Okay, so who lost the battle is not part of the original construction here. And this last, like, ask yourself whether you need to present a sentence or part of sentences in passive. We talked a little bit about that with the method section, right? So here's an example of a sentence that depends on a passive construction for its meaning. So sometimes it's essential for you, in this it's because you have multiple potential agents in this sentence. So the actor was hit by a car. So the car hit the actor, that would be active, but here we need it to be passive. And the reason being, the actor was hit by the car last week and could not perform in last night's play. So we need to have the reason about the actor, not being able to perform because he was hit by a car. Actor could not perform. Notice that actor was hit, actor could not perform. Those are two different verbs connecting to that one subject. And so it relies on that first part of it being passive for us to get that meaning. So sometimes you'll wind up with sentences like that. All right. What do you do if your advisor hates passive voice sentences? Just acknowledge and say, yes, I understand. And I would say that your advisors still wind up being your best guides for writing in your genres, what style you need to be writing in. They know your field of study much, much better than I do. So regardless of your advisor's preferences, you want to be the person who can make those choices. And you can choose in order to, make sure that you're writing in a style that pleases your advisor, that you craft active voice sentences, but also then knowing that you have the power to use passive voice when you choose. And Nathan Sheffield from Duke, he's just got some great advice here. He says, generally, I prefer active voice, but I think that passive voice has its place in scientific writing. The best thing to do is use a mix of the two. Use passive when necessary to maintain cohesion. When you do, make sure that the actor, that agent, is not ambiguous, right? We wouldn't get confused on who's doing what. And make sure your passive sentences are intentional and not habitual. More important than active versus passive debate is the structure of your writing. So make your writing flow, connecting one sentence to the next, and it will be understandable. And so if you have an advisor who may be resistant to passive voice, maybe you could give share some of Nathan Sheffield's advice as well. You can find Nathan Sheffield's advice at the Duke Thompson Writing Lab, as well as the Duke Scientific Resources. And those, again, are attached to your Outlook invite. And so until we meet again, may your writing be brief, frequent, low stress, and highly rewarding and active. Or if it's passive, may you write passive with intention, right? So thank you for attending. I'm going to send an email later on. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and stop recording so we can open it up for a little bit of conversation for those of you who could stick around. And if you can't stick around, I understand.